on this. So, once again, hello everybody, welcome, and thank you all for coming for the 11th lecture of our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I'm Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium, and the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank Faperj Capus for their financial support, and the members of the research groups Pragma, Uzia, and Polyphonia for their academic support. Now, we've got a new setup today, since we're using Zoom instead of StreamYard, but we'll stick with our usual protocol. The lecture will be delivered in full, then we'll have a round of questions from our debaters before moving on to any questions from the audience. The difference, of course, is that everybody will be able to ask their own questions. In order to avoid any possible technical problems, I'll ask everybody to keep their cameras and microphones turned off during the presentation. And if you have any questions, that you not only raise your hand, but also say so in the chat, so I can keep up with who is supposed to go first. Speaking of the chat, let me not forget to remind those of you who need certificates that they should fill in the form that will be made available in the chat during our session. And to let the debaters know, both that they are co-hosts in the meeting, and that if they wish to send messages between them in the chat, there's an option of sending messages only to hosts and co-hosts. So I think this is all for the technicalities. Today we're joined by Professor James Lennox here. He's delivering our lecture, and to debate his lecture, we have Professor Lucas Angioni, Breno Zupolini, Roberto Grasso, and Sophia Conan. So let me briefly thank them all for joining us today. And without any more delay, welcome Professor Lennox to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you all for being here. And as I've said, I would very much love it if I could be giving this talk live to you in Brazil, but this is certainly better than nothing. So I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. And that should be good. All right. Quick introduction to what's going on here. This talk is, one way to view it is as a kind of offering you a different way of looking at a number of the themes in the book I recently published, Aristotle on Inquiry. And I want to start with this quote from Nabokov: "Curiosity is insubordination in its purest form." You can see my grandson over there on the right being insubordinate, in fact, poking one of my cats. I think what Nabokov had in mind in saying that is that the one thing that somebody who insists on you being a subordinate, somebody who's a figure of authority, the one thing that such figures cannot stand is somebody asking why all the time. And I want to sort of think about Aristotle's views about inquiry through the lens of him exploring the nature of curiosity. So there are three backgrounds to the talk that I won't say anything about other than mentioning the background, basically. First of all, things I learned from my grandson during the first 3 or 4 years of his life. My wife and I spent a lot of time helping my daughter and son-in-law raise that grandson, especially in those early years. He spent many days, more hours with his grandparents than he did with his parents. And that led me to start doing some research in the psychology of curiosity. And as I did that, I discovered that there ought to be far more interplay between the epistemology of inquiry and the psychology of curiosity than there has been. And that's an important part of the background today. The quote that I showed you from Nabokov is mentioned by Azar Nafisi in a lecture that she gave. And she describes curiosity, maybe even defines it, as the desire to know what one does not know. And she says it's essential to genuine knowledge. And then she mentions the quote by Nabokov. And finally, the third background is a a theme that's been a minor key in the philosophy of science through a very large chunk of the 20th century, and then seem to have gotten dropped and buried, and people are only now starting to come back to it. And that's what I call eroteticism, which is just a fancy Greek-derived word for the logic of questions and answers. Okay, so the first background then is my grandson. What I noticed, what I found fascinating, was that as he figured out how to form his first simple concepts and his first simple sentences, he almost simultaneously becomes obsessed by the power of two questions. What is that and why? And that led me to ponder, to ask the question, is there some connection between our capacity for conceptual thought, for forming, as Aristotle would say, universals, and the child's passion for asking these questions? What I had noticed was that the capacities come online almost simultaneously, and I was basically asking whether that's just a coincidence. And what led me to start looking into the psychology of curiosity was I was curious. I was curious to know whether somebody was actually asking these questions. And it turns out they were. So as one example of many, a paper by Kidd and Hayden published in Neuron in 2015 called The Psychology and Neuroscience of Curiosity. It's basically a review article of all the attempts that have been made in the previous 40 years or so to define curiosity. And that paper closed with a list of what I found really interesting questions that they say are still outstanding questions in the field. And here they are. In what way does curiosity resemble other basic drive states? And how does it differ from those? To what extent is curiosity, this is another way of saying the same thing, fundamentally different from drives like hunger and thirst? And what I noticed was that all the discussions that they reviewed in this article stressed the centrality of what and why questions to what they referred to as epistemic curiosity. The definitions that they were looking at were all variants of an intrinsically motivated desire or drive for knowledge or information. That was sort of that if you wanted to abstract what was common to all the different views they'd reviewed, that's what you would get out. So what I noticed was in all of this literature, they tended to view curiosity as seeking answers to what and why questions. That, they all said, was the most obvious manifestation of this epistemic curiosity that they were interested in. Well, that should now begin to sound a little bit like it's pointing in the direction of Aristotle. Okay, the third background, and I'll just review this very quickly. Starting in 1955, Arthur and Mary Pryor published a paper called Aerotech Logic. What they were trying to do was formulate a formalism for capturing the different kinds of questions that can be asked and showing how those structures dictated the structures that the answer propositions would take. Later than that, two people at the University of Pittsburgh, Neil Belknap, John Anderson, published a book called The Logic of Questions and Answers. And I was very excited when I first picked that book up, but it became very uninteresting to me when I discovered that almost the entire book is focused on questions whether and which. They only actually have 2 pages in the entire book devoted to the question of to why questions. But why questions become very important in the period between 1960 and 1990 in the philosophy of science. There's a big literature around the question of the relationship between explanation and why questions. There's a very well-known paper by Sylvan Bromberger called Why Questions, published in a volume that came out of the Center for Philosophy of Science lectures at the University of Pittsburgh, called Why Questions. Paul Teller responds to that paper in 1974 in a paper in Noose. Wes Salmon, his APA presidential address was called Why, Ask Why. And a large chunk of Bas van Frossen's The Scientific Image is devoted to what he calls a theory of why questions, a kind of relevance logic organized around why questions. If you want a quick introduction to all of that literature, Wes Salmon's 4 Decades of Scientific Explanation has a thread running through the whole book that's looking at this exploration of why questions. But what I noticed was that almost all of that literature is focused on explanation. Almost none of it is focused on inquiry. And yet it seemed to me that why questions are all about inquiry, and maybe why answers are what you end up with and what provides you with some kind of explanation. All right, so now we're ready to think about Aristotle from that perspective. Does he have a concept of curiosity? When I first asked that question, I thought, well, is there a word that typically gets translated curiosity? And there is, philomatheia. It's literally, of course, as you all know, love of learning, but it's often translated as curiosity. So the first text, I sent out some texts that I think Danielle sent around to you. The first one on that list is this one, which I absolutely love, from Book 10, Chapter 5 of Nicomachean Ethics. Living is a type of energeia, and we are all active towards the objects we most, I can't actually see because I've got my images in front of me. Whoops, sorry. What's the word there, folks? The objects we like most. Yeah, okay. Right. The musician activates hearing regarding melodies. The lover of learning activates thinking regarding the objects of study, and so on for other living activities. All right, so the lover of learning, or the curious person, activates thinking regarding the objects of his studies. And that's a form of living activity, Aristotle says. And then, of course, something you're all familiar with, there's the first sentence of the Metaphysics. All human beings by nature desire knowledge. The root meaning of origomai, of course, is to reach out or to stretch out or to yearn for something. And with this putting the stress on by nature, the idea that desire for human beings, desire to know is part of our nature as human beings, really gets us pretty close to that generic definition of curiosity that we were talking about earlier. It's some kind of desire, or if you like, drive to know that's part of our nature as human beings. It's an epistemic drive, if you like. So you could translate that sentence as all human beings are by nature curious. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is sort of looking at the ideas in Aristotle on inquiry from the standpoint of the centrality of questions and answers to Aristotle's theory of inquiry, or the way he understands inquiry. And I view this as an exercise in metaphilosophy, if you like. I'm not going to be directly focused on Aristotle's content, that is, the actual ideas that he espouses, so much as his philosophical method. I guess I'll be focused on his ideas about philosophical method rather than about the natural world firsthand. As I argue in the second chapter of Aristotle on Inquiry, I see all of his inquiries as shaped by multiple what I call aerotetic frameworks, that is, frameworks framed around certain kinds of questions that need to be answered. And a basic feature of the framework that the book 2 of the Analytics puts in place is its domain neutrality. It's providing an aerotetic framework for any knowledge-seeking activity. And I think the way to look at it is that framework is shaped, and this goes back to the prior 1955 paper about aerotetic logic, that the framework that those questions put in place is shaped by the conception of scientific knowledge that Aristotle develops in book 1 of the Posterior Analytics, so that knowing the goal that you're seeking helps shape the framework of the questions that you're going to be asking. But it does so at a very abstract level. Okay, well, let's look at one piece of evidence that Aristotle does have this idea in mind. It's from the Eudemian Ethics, book 1, chapter 6. This is the second text on the handout that Daniel sent around. In every field of inquiry, arguments made philosophically differ from those made non-philosophically. Hence, one should not, and again, I have to look at my other page. If I get there. Well, anyway, one should not stay away from, when it comes to politics, regard as superfluous the kinds of inquiries that make clear not only the what, toti, but also the in accordance to what, the to deity, for this is the philosophical approach in every inquiry. Methodos is what I'm translating as inquiry there. But if you've read the book, you know that I have some doubts about just translating it that way. All right, why is this giving epistemic priority to why questions or what questions? Well, not only is the pursuit of knowledge the seeking of answers to what and why questions, but the successful pursuit of knowledge is critically dependent on 3 other things. First, the kind of questions that are being asked, the order in which they're asked. For Aristotle, that's absolutely critical. And finally, the suitability of the questions to the domain of inquiry. So in the book, I developed the idea that there are domain-specific questions that one needs to ask that you wouldn't be able to infer from the abstract framework that you get out of book 2 of the Posterior Analytics. There are domain-specific frameworks that are determinate forms tooled for the particular domain of inquiry that you're interested in of the broader, more abstract framework that you find in the analytics. It's this normative dimension that I'm going to be focused on today, that successful pursuit of knowledge, successful inquiry requires that you pay attention to these three other aspects of inquiry. Okay, so I think of book 2 as a very general study of inquiry. You can just think of it as a book called On Inquiry. And it's focused on 4 modes of inquiry and their intersections. It opens, this is the third text on your handout, saying the things into which we inquire are equal in number to those we know scientifically. Now, that immediately raises the question, okay, what are those things and how many of them are there? There are 2 different kinds of answers you could give to that opening question. One would be what I call content answers, where you say, well, let's see, we inquire into the heavens, into numbers, into figures, into animals, into plants, and so on. So those are the many kinds of things we inquire into, and we want to know. But that's, of course, not the kind of answer that Aristotle gives to this opening question. He gives what I call framework answers. He says, we inquire into 4 things: the fact, the reason why, whether it is, and what it is. So it's not specific kinds of contents that we seek to know scientifically that he's interested in. It's the modes of inquiry that he's interested in. And they correspond to the modes of things, the forms of things that we want to know. So this is inquiry driven by the desire to know. And as I mentioned earlier, according to contemporary psychology that's looking into curiosity, that's exactly what curiosity is. All right, so there are 4 modes of inquiry. Aristotle tells us at the beginning of book 2 of the Posterior Analytics, characterized in terms of 4 questions. And they're laid out as 2 ordered pairs of questions. Is it the case that P? And why is it the case that P? Are there S's, subject terms, or P's, predicate terms? And what are these S's and P's? And those what are questions can become more and more intense, ending up with an account of the essence of the thing. What is it to be that thing? What is it to be that subject or that predicate? So that first pair represent a causal inquiry, Aristotle goes on to tell us. The second pair represent a conceptual inquiry. First ordered pair, from tohati to todihati, is laid out in text 4 that I sent around. For when we inquire whether this or that is the case, for example, whether the sun is in eclipse or not, we inquire into the fact. An indication of this is that, having discovered that it is in eclipse, we have finished our whether it is inquiry. And sorry, there, that helps. An indication of this is that, having discovered that it is in eclipse, we have finished our whether it is inquiry. And if we know from the start that it's in eclipse, we do not inquire whether it is. And when we know the fact, we inquire into the reason why. For example, knowing that it is in eclipse or that the Earth is moved, we inquire into the reason why it is in eclipse or moved. For some reason, don't quite know why, Daniel, but for some reason, my computer is not allowing me to change slides.
Oh.
So it's just
There's nothing, I don't think there's nothing we can do to help you. If you like, you can send it to me, then I start sharing.
I don't know what's going on.
Have you maybe got the wrong program selected? No.
It was working fine until now, and I don't know. Let me stop sharing for just a second and then come back in and see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, that seems to have done the trick. Okay, second pair of inquiries represented in the fifth text. We inquire into something in another way. For example, whether there is or is not a centaur or a god. And by whether it is or is not, I mean in an unqualified way, not whether the centaur or the god is or is not white. And knowing that it is, we inquire what it is. For example, what is God or what is man? And notice that the centaur has disappeared from the list of questions here. And that's because you would get a negative answer to your question, whether there is such a thing to the centaur. So here we're not asking is S P, we're asking are there S's or are there P's? If the answer is affirmative, then we can go on to inquire what is S or what is it to be an S or a P? Now there is a puzzle that I'll just mention and not say anything about it now for lack of time, but there's a puzzle about the examples. Both these whether inquiries are, you'll notice, about substance entities, gods, human beings, centaurs. Much of the theory of inquiry in book 2 of the Posterior Analytics, however, ignores that category completely. Most of the examples of what is it inquiries are about processes and attributes of substances. You know all this: thunders, eclipse, leaf shedding, reflection, and so on and so forth. Now, that's the story you get out of chapter 1 of the Posterior Analytics. It's a very simple and elegant view about 4 different inquiries related to 4 things we want to know. And it lays them out in nice, neat pairs so that one kind has to be done first before you move on to the second in each pair. But things get a lot more complicated in the second chapter. And at the beginning of that chapter, he says, but we are inquiring, when we inquire about the fact or the unqualified, whether there is a middle or not. While when, having come to know either the fact or the whether it is, either partially or without qualification, we inquire into the reason why, totiati, or the what it is, toti esti. We are then inquiring what the middle is. Okay, so what's going on here? A little bit later, he says, for the middle is the cause, and in all cases, this is the object of inquiry. So this complicates the story in chapter 1 in three distinct ways. First of all, the distinction between the two preliminary inquiries is minimized. Both are now inquiries about whether there is a middle. Second, the distinction between the inquiries into the cause and into the what is it is also minimized. Search for the cause is the search for what the middle is. Notice searching for the, if you like, dihoti or deity is searching for the TSD of the middle. And the two stages are now said to be both causal inquiries. In all cases, it's the middle or the cause that is the ultimate object of inquiry. So even when you're asking whether something is or whether a certain predication holds, you're already involved in a causal inquiry. You just haven't gotten to the point where you're actually searching for the cause. But these preliminary stages are steps on the way to those inquiries. At least that's the way I'm understanding what's going on here. Okay, so these begin to lay out the framework norms for any knowledge-seeking inquiry. Questions of the form, why P, assume that P is established. And Aristotle makes a caveat about that. That assumption is only justified if the result of asking and affirmatively answering a prior question has succeeded. Is it the case that P? Likewise, with the what it is inquiry. That assumption is justified on the assumption that the results of asking and affirmatively answering a prior question has been successful. Is there or are there S's or P's? And of course, as soon as you start to think about that, an Aristotelian form of the Meno problem rears its ugly head. How do we affirmatively answer whether there are S's prior to knowing what S's are? And my take, as I've argued for many years, is that Aristotle spends a good deal of the whole of the second book of the posterior Lennox working on his own answer to that kind of Meno problem. All right, now I want to turn to the way in which that general framework is determinatively shaped into a framework for natural inquiry. And what I'll do for the rest of the talk is, first of all, look at that general natural science framework, and then look at a specific example, namely the example that I focus on in the last chapter of Aristotle on Inquiry, his look at his development of an inquiry into the nature of respiration. All right, so I won't necessarily read through all of these texts. They're pretty familiar to most of you, but I'll just point out salient features. Notice that right at the beginning of Physics, Book 1, Chapter 1, he frames the inquiry in precisely the way the author of the posterior Ethics would be expected to, right? We think we know each thing when we know the cause of that thing. But he adds to that the causes and the primary principles and even the elements. He says that's also the case with scientific knowledge of nature. So he's extending that framework to the science of nature. The goal of the inquiry, says, is knowledge of causes, but it's also knowledge of principles and elements. And it's an interesting feature which we could talk about if you want. I've got only speculations about this, but I have thought about it. Book 1, you'll notice, is focused almost entirely on principles and hardly ever discusses causes. Book 2, of course, is all about causes. So if you think about the difference in the inquiries in Book 1 and Book 2, that gives you some hint or idea, I think, of what Aristotle means by distinguishing causes and principles in this particular context. So chapter 3, as you all know, develops his 4 causes theory, but it does so in a way that hardly mentions any kind of natural object of inquiry. It's focused on all kinds of other kinds of things, musical interludes, reasons for going for a walk, and so on and so forth, but it's not focused on nature. But notice the aerotetic nature of the inquiry. First of all, in that introductory passage, he says, our inquiry is for the sake of knowing. And then the analytics framework comes in. We don't think we know each thing until we grasp deity, on account of what. And of course, when he develops his 4 causes in this chapter, it's 4 different answers to deity. So the one he really apparently thinks people are going to balk at is the teleological answer to the question. Again, he says, cause is spoken of as end, and this is for the sake of that, for the sake of which. For example, the end of walking is health. And then he gives us an aerotetic framework. Why is he walking? We reply, in order to be healthy. And saying this, we think we've given the cause. Okay, so as I've mentioned, he doesn't in chapter 3, which is of course just a duplicate of a chapter in Metaphysics Delta, make much of how you would apply this 4 causal framework to the natural world. And that carries over to the introduction to chapter 7 of book 2. But then, and this is the 10th text that I've given you, he does directly apply it to the study of nature. It's apparent that the causes are these and this many, and since the causes are 4, it's for the natural scientist to know all of them, and he will answer the question on account of what, in a way appropriate to natural science, by taking it back to all of them, the matter, the form, the moving cause, and that for the sake of which. All right, so we need these 4 questions to be answered in a manner that is physikos, in a manner that's appropriate for the natural scientist. What about investigating animals? Well, this is familiar territory, so I'll just go over this very quickly, but we know the analytics aerotetic frameworks in place. The history of animals, of course, famously has this passage that says, first we study, doing a historia, the differences and attributes that are present in all animals. And we have to do that before we make an attempt to go on and discover the causes. That's the natural way to do things if we want to have demonstrative understanding, he says. And of course, the beginning of the investigation of the parts of animals at book 2, chapter 1, reiterates this idea that the historia of these parts has been done in the history of animals. Now we're going on to investigate the causes on account of which each animal has the things that they have. And you get exactly the same framework introducing de incessu animalium. That's text 13. All right, so now what I want to do is show how that framework is narrowed down first to the natural world, then to the study of animals. And now we're going to look at it in a very particular study of animal investigation, namely the study of respiration. Remember that in Parts of Animals 1:1, Aristotle defends the priority among the 4 causes. He only mentions 2, but he just says those are examples. The priority of the that for the sake of which question, the question, what is X for? And that carries over very clearly to his study of respiration. Right at the beginning of that investigation, he says, a few of the natural philosophers have spoken previously about respiration, yet for what purpose it is, tinos karin, it belongs to animals. Some have said nothing, while others, though they've spoken, have done so poorly due to a lack of experience. So what he's saying here is there are two necessary conditions for getting things right that have not been followed by his predecessors. First of all, getting appropriate experience, figuring out which animals breathe and which animals have the appropriate parts for breathing, and asking it in a teleological framework, where you give priority to that teleological question, what's it for? And we see him really carrying through on that in the first 8 chapters of this investigation, all of which are looking at previous attempts to get clear on respiration and consistently criticizing them for not framing their investigation within a teleological framework. He sums up the point in text 15. The most significant reason for these thinkers not discussing these things well is a combination of their being inexperienced with regard to the internal parts, and that of course requires dissection, and not grasping that nature makes them for the sake of something. For inquiring for the sake of what respiration belongs to animals and examining this question in the presence of the parts, in the presence of gills and lungs, they would have discovered the cause quickly, he says. All right, so you only study the organs involved in respiration by, in most cases, doing dissection, functional anatomy, but he's saying you have to do it with the question, what is respiration for, in mind while you're doing the investigation. Now, here's a little puzzle in this passage, which I talk about in the last chapter of my book. Gills are not, in Aristotle's view, involved in respiration. In fact, one of his major criticisms of his predecessors is they keep trying to claim fish breathe. And he says, no, they don't. So why are gills mentioned in this passage? Okay, spoiler alert. Plug your ears and look away if you don't want to know the answer. But here's the answer. Anatomical experience turns out to suggest that gills serve the very same function as lungs do. That is, Aristotle says the what are they for question gets the same answer, even though gills are not for breathing, they're not for respiration. All right. One aside on Aristotle bringing home the point of the importance of asking what things are for, asking the teleological or functional question. This is from the last chapter of book 5 of The Generation of Animals. And it's about why some animals grow teeth early on and then lose those teeth and grow a second set later on. And he's criticizing Democritus's answer to this question. He was neglecting to discuss that for the sake of which he refers everything which nature uses to necessity. And while being such, they are nevertheless for the sake of something and for the better concerning each animal. So nothing prevents teeth coming to be, that is, arising, emerging, and falling out in the way Democritus says. But Aristotle says it's not on account of these things, but on account of the end that they do these things. These things that he mentions, that Democritus mentions, are causes, Aristotle says, but they're causes as movers and as instruments and as matter. They're not that for the sake of which, they're not the priority cause. and he just doesn't ask that question. Okay, so what he's saying is the inquiry is methodologically flawed from the outset. Given the goal that you're seeking, you're never going to get to that goal if you don't frame your inquiry in a teleological manner. All right, so let me take you back now to curiosity. Remember, it's insubordination in its purest form. So curiosity is all about not accepting facts at their face value, but wanting to question them. Now think about Aristotelian Problemata in that framework. What is obsessively common to the Problemata is that to deity question, being constantly asked about puzzling facts. And here's an example that I can give you out of the investigation of respiration. In the History of Animals, book 7, 589a32 is where this quote comes from. Aristotle says that dolphins and other creatures with blowholes are the oddest of animals, peritota panton tonzon. Having established that these creatures have no legs and live their entire lives in water, it turns out they also have lungs and breathe air. And one who is curious will wonder why. That's a very strange combination of attributes. As I've argued in a number of papers and also in Aristotle and Inquiry, Posterior Analytics Book 2, Chapter 14 to 18, and Prior Analytics 1, 27 to 30 are all about the search for, in the latter case, middle terms, and in the former case, for causal explanations, by starting with identifying the problems that you want to find answers to. So, for example, you know that cetaceans, dolphins, whales, porpoises, have lungs, they breathe, they live an aquatic lifestyle. And so you know that lungs belong to all cetaceans. But because they lead an aquatic lifestyle, that's extremely puzzling. That's extremely problematic. Why would animals that spend their entire lives in waters and have no legs have lungs? So you ask why. And the search for a satisfying answer is the search for the appropriate causal middle. You're asking for the reason why, for example, dolphins have lungs. Curiosity is driving the search for a demonstrative explanation for that fact. So what's the answer? Well, here it is. It's in chapter 12 of On Respiration. It's only part of the answer because, as you'll see as we read through this, it will raise all kinds of further questions that would need to be answered for a full explanation. But he says one might be perplexed, one might be in aporia about the cetaceans among the water dwellers, that is the dolphins, whales, and as many others as have the so-called olon, the so-called pipe. Although these facts align with our account, they are catalogon. So one might be perplexed because these animals are footless, and though possessing lungs, they take in seawater. And Aristotle says, but the cause of this weird conjunction of differentia is the one stated just now. For these do not take in water for the sake of cooling. In fact, what he says elsewhere is that they take in the water simply as a part of their feeding mechanism. He goes on to say, cooling for these animals takes place by breathing, for they have lungs. And that's why they sleep holding their mouth up out of the water. And dolphins actually snore. Okay, so there is an answer to the question why all dolphins, in fact, all cetaceans at the proper level of explanation, have lungs. Because they actually cool themselves by breathing, unlike fish who cool themselves using their gills to take in and expel water. Now, Aristotle is actually amazing that he knows as much as he knows about these creatures. He knows they have all these mammalian characteristics, of course, but he gets a lot of it wrong. He actually thinks the blowhole doesn't play any role in breathing for these creatures. He thinks it's just a way of them expelling water. But nevertheless, you see how the explanation works, and you see how the nature of the inquiry is driven by the kind of answer that he wants to get at. And that's what I wanted you to see in this example. Okay, so that's pretty much the story I want to tell. If you want to see how that quick explanation, which leads to many other questions, would look demonstratively, lungs belong to all who cool the blood by breathing. Cooling by breathing belongs to all cetaceans. So lungs belong to all cetaceans because they belong to creatures that cool themselves by breathing. Or to put it another way that actually embeds the cause into the demonstration, lungs belong to animals for the sake of cooling themselves by breathing. Cooling their blood by breathing belongs to all cetaceans, and so lungs belong to all cetaceans. Okay, and there we have a dolphin who is in fact asleep with his mouth out of the water, maybe snoring, I don't know. And a couple of dolphins who are swimming underwater, but of course they will eventually have to surface in order to take in, breathe, and expel air because they breathe by means of lungs. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. We already have one question lined up here in the chat by Lucas. Lucas, if you please, your question. Anybody else who has questions, please say so in the chat so I can order the inquiry.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jim. So my question is quite general and related to something you touch upon in your talk and in your book as well, which is the following. The Aerotech Framework from Posterior Analytics 1.1.1.1.2 is not restricted to substances, to entities that are as substances. And I would like you to expand on that because
can I just add that not only is it not restricted, but they're hardly even mentioned in
exactly
most of the examples in book 2.
Exactly, and I completely agree with that. And I think that although this is quite clear, quite conspicuous in Aristotle texts, sometimes we find the literature insisting that inquiry and the goal of inquiry, which is scientific knowledge, is primarily focused on substances, which might be true in a way, but somehow we find this in a misleading way, as if Aristotle was in his biological treatises, for instance, interest in studying, for instance, dolphins by themselves, or elephants by themselves, or kangaroos by themselves, etc., etc. And instead of being focused on respiration, on some sort of behaviors that all those animals have as a group or as relevantly described in a certain way, etc. And I would like to see you saying more on this, because I think it is really important, because even people that agree that in posterior analytics, the focus on those 3-4 questions are not restricted on substance. Sometimes they end up with this old idea that comes from the priority to substance in the metaphysics, they end up with this idea that, well, Aristotelian sciences is primarily interested in saying things about substance, which is correct, but the fact is that Aristotle is more focused on the attributes, not on the substance. This is the question.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I have a number of different lines of response to that, because I essentially agree with you. So it's really just lines of evidence to support the thought that you're having there. First of all, remember what he says at the beginning. The first problem that he deals with in Parts of Animals 1:1 is, should we inquire about lion, horse, man by themselves, or should we inquire at a general level about attributes that belong in common according to kind? And it's pretty clear when you get to chapter 4 that only in cases where you can't inquire in that latter way should you actually go down to the level of a particular kind of substance and inquire about it. And even then, I expect the inquiry would be at that level simply because there's some attribute that only belongs to that particular kind of animal, like a trunk belonging to an elephant, for example, or a peculiar way of hopping belonging to kangaroos, to use your other example. So right at the beginning of the Parts of Animals, and I take it it's a general introduction to all of the biology, not just to the Parts of Animals. He's telling you, and chapter 4 of book 1 gives you the way you go about doing it. He's telling you that the inquiry what you should be looking for is the widest level kind to which an attribute belongs, because you want to explain why that attribute belongs to the kind of subject it belongs to. That's the nature of your inquiry. You're inquiring into why various attributes belong to various kinds of things, but those various kinds of things will seldom be particular kinds of animals. It'll usually be at a much more abstract level, where Aristotle says typically we don't even have appropriate names for the groups. So take lungs, for example. Think of all the different kinds of animals that have lungs. In terms of modern taxonomy, you'd have to go way up to the level of above order in order to characterize all of the animals that have lungs. So if you want to get a proper explanation for why some kind of animal has lungs, you won't be, this is why dolphins have lungs, this is why. Now, cetaceans, you'll notice, they do require a special kind of explanation, even though that's not the widest kind that has lungs. But they require a special kind of explanation because they have all these other attributes that would lead you into aporia, that would lead you to wonder, why would an animal that spends its entire life in water and has no legs, can't even get up on land, why would such an animal have lungs? Why would it breathe air? So you do have to ask that question there, because you have all these collaboration of attributes that there needs to be an explanation of why all those attributes coexist in that particular kind of animal. So, and then if you look at his actual science, look at the science of animals. It's never, there's no treatise about any particular kind of animal, even at a very large scale level. There's no treatise on fish or on birds. There are treatises on the parts of animals, and there you try to find the highest level of universality to which a particular part belongs, and then you explain why it belongs to just those kinds of creatures. And in the parts of animals, often the subject of the attribute is characterized as all the things that have some other attribute. So, so I think, if you actually look at the scientific practice, he's not interested primarily in investigating substances. he's interested in investigating whatever genos, if you like, has a particular kind of attribute, because that's what you want to explain. And you're going to try to find what's causally basic about that widest kind that has that attribute, that explains why it has that attribute. Why does it have lungs? Because it cools by means of air, and all animals that cool by means of air have to have lungs. So that's the answer. I think you're just plain right that Aristotelian science is not primarily focused on trying to get some kind of explanation of a particular kind of animal. That's just not the way the science works, in my view. So I mean, basically, I'm in agreement with your question. Let's put it that way. And I think you're right. A lot of people recognize that when they look at the science, but then they try to come up with some reason why, because of Aristotle's metaphysical view about what primary substance is, there must be an answer to why the science looks so unlike that. And I don't think it looks unlike that. I think it's what you would expect.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas and James, for the answer. We have two more questions from the debaters. First, Breno, and then Sophia. And then if there are no further questions from the debaters, we have questions from Constanza, Samara, and Maria Alice in the audience. So, Breno, your time.
Hi, Professor Lennox. I'm very glad to meet you.
It's nice to meet you
Thank
too.
you for your presentation.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, sure. Yes, I have the following question about your view on Aerotech Framework, and perhaps you answered that on your book, but unfortunately I didn't have the time to read it yet. So for Aristotle, I mean, in the second chapter of the second book of the Posterior Ethics, it seems that Aristotle thinks that knowing that S is P is the same as knowing that there is a cause for P belonging to S, right? So knowing that there is a middle term or a cause. So, and some interpreters suggest that Aristotle's view on, or at least Aristotle's discussion in this chapter is restricted to very specific kind of questions about scientific facts. So Aristotle would be primarily interested in the sort of predicative relation that is regular, necessary, or for the most part, and so present a certain kind of regularity that suggests that there is an underlying cause for that fact. I'd like to know if you agree with that, especially because Aristotle briefly mentions katas in bebekos predications in chapter 2, line 98, 10, 11, 9 to 11. And how, I'd like to know whether you think that this Aerotech framework that you attribute to Aristotle also involves investigating facts that turn out to be not properly scientific explananda. And anyway, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Right. So the first part of your question, I think I might need to say more about this, but as a first pass, I would say yes, that I think what the second chapter is trying to do is make it clear that the two tracks of inquiry that were laid out in the first chapter are actually very intricately intertwined with one another. And I think you see just how intertwined they become when you get to chapters 8, 9, and 10, where he eventually in chapter 10 says that you can just reword the causal inquiry and the causal answer to inquiry, and it ends up being an answer to the what is it question as well. Now, the issue of accidental predication and its role in both the theory of demonstration that Aristotle lays out and in his actual inquiries, I think is a much trickier one. First of all, as you know, in book 1, he actually has a kind of per se predication that he will characterize as katasumbe because so he might have that in mind. But it's also the case that when you take a look at his actual scientific practice, I mean, a good example here is Generation of Animals, book 5. And you look at all of the things that Aristotle is trying to explain in that chapter, in that book. They are things that Aristotle, I think, would routinely refer to as accidental predications. The fact that some people have curly hair and some people have straight hair. The fact that some people have blue eyes and some people have brown eyes. The fact that the wolves on one valley have the sheep on one side of a mountain have very thick wool, and those on the other side of the mountain have much thinner wool. And yet he gives us scientific explanations of those things. So those are, in a way, accidental predications. If you're thinking of, is it true, either necessarily or for the most part, that all sheep have such and such? That's not what you're going to get. So what's going on in a chapter like that? Well, I think one thing that he tells us is going on is that these are cases where you can't look for answers in the formal or final causal framework. The answers you'll get here are due to material and environmental differences. And you can get explanations, and I think you could even probably frame the explanations in a kind of demonstrative form, but they're going to be explanations that are, in our sense, highly contingent on the environmental framework of the organism, the material makeup of the organism, and things like that. So I often wonder, because the analytics operates at such an abstract framework, to what extent is Aristotle trying to make it sort of broad enough that he can encompass these kinds of things? I mean, the common view is he's modeling his theory of demonstration on mathematics, right? That's a very common way to think about the first book. But the second book, almost all the examples are from natural inquiry, or at least non-mathematical forms of inquiry. And so I think his eye in book 2 is much wider in scope. He's trying, can I develop a theory of inquiry that encompasses meteorology, that encompasses the kind of thing that you find in Generation of Animals, book 5. But I have to say, I don't have a better answer than that, and I don't think that's a very good answer, frankly. I think it needs a lot more study, a lot more thought.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Would you think that perhaps those explananda, like certain ships having curly hair due to some environmental aspect of, could we say that perhaps there is an interpretation of that fact that would gives us a sort of proper explanando and a sort of per se predication. For instance, if we describe if we take the subject to be not ships, but animals in a certain,
with a certain kind of material.
living, yeah. I think that would be a way of like, it would be a matter of how we interpreted the fact. We would come up with proper per se explanando, and that would kind of sort of make it more amenable to what Aristotle is saying in the posterior.
I mean, that fits with very much. I'm very comfortable with that because that's the way I think of how Aristotle thinks about explanation, is that you try to find the appropriate level, abstract level or descriptive, the appropriate description of your subject so that the predicate belongs per se to that subject. And often that's just a matter of finding the right way of describing the subject. So yeah, I think that's a possibility, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Brandon and James. Now, Sophia, please.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. That was really, really great, Jim. And I wanted to go back to curiosity and the psychology of curiosity. I found your presentation really picked up on that, like really strongly. And I think so kind of very, very broad general question, going back to the metaphysics, the beginning of the metaphysics. It looks like that kind of curiosity is natural to human beings. In fact, it might be an essential feature of human beings. And so your Aerotech framework is a development or a extension of this natural ability. And given that, how much training do we need, do you think Aristotle thinks? Because do we just let people get on with it? It doesn't look like that's quite the case, because Democritus keeps getting it wrong, and other people are not. So how is it that we need to develop people's curiosity in the right direction? So that's kind of the first very, very general point. The second point is, I just wondered, I did read your book. You sent me a draft about a year ago, and no doubt it's covered in the book, but I wondered if you could just clarify again to me. You showed very well how we get from the posterior analytics to the physics, to the parts of animals, and on respiration, and how there's this kind of question and answer methodology that runs throughout. But at some stage, we get kind of teleology taking over, the final cause taking over, whereas I felt as if in the posterior analytics, there was talk of causes, but they weren't necessarily final causes. And I think maybe your answer to the previous, to Brenno, was sort of covering this, which was that, well, posterior analytics is much broader and covers other kinds of explanation, not just and maybe the teleological aspect is the domain-specific natural scientific way of putting together this Aerotech framework.
Thanks, Sophia. Both good questions. Let's see. On the first question, what I'm, oh, sorry. There's a, I just looked out my window. I live on the edge of a park, and there's a 10-point buck walking across the lawn, across the street. So it took me away from the presentation for a moment. What I'm trying to do in the book is to suggest, well, in this paper, in a way, is to suggest that Aristotle is interested in how we can formulate questions in such a way that they will take us to a kind of knowledge that he's laid out in book 1 of the posterior analytics. So to some extent, the answer to your first question is people aren't going to get inquiry right if they don't have the goal right. But unlike most people commenting right now on the posterior analytics, I actually think that Aristotle has a view of, pretty elaborate view of inductive inquiry, such that there are norms for that inductive inquiry that are in place right from the start. And those norms are set by the goal that you're trying to achieve. So to some extent, if you're teaching a novice, let's say, how to become a scientist, and I don't know at what point Aristotle would think you could start doing that. He thinks you can start doing it with mathematics much earlier, that's for sure. You need a lot of experience, but you need experience of the right kind. For example, if you're studying the parts of animals and you want to study the internal parts of animals, there's only one way to do that. There's only one way to gain that experience, and that's dissection. But Aristotle says, even if you do dissection and you don't do it correctly, you're going to be led off track. And this leads me to the teleological question. And that means, Aristotle thinks, that you have to do dissection in the right way. But he actually claims in On Respiration, you have to start with the right kind of questions in view, or you're not going to know what to look at, or why you're looking at it, or why it's moving the way it's moving, or why are the lungs attached to the heart? Why are these tubes running from the heart to the lungs, and why are these tubes that run from the esophagus and the windpipe? Why are the ones that come from the windpipe going into the lungs, and why are they laying right up next to the ones that are coming from the heart? And you have to be asking those kinds of why questions while you're doing the dissection, or the dissection will be a waste of time. I think that's what he's saying. Now, the analytics does say things about the final cause. The chapter on causes, chapter 11, has a discussion of the four modes of explanation, let's put it that way, because there's great debate, and I think appropriately great debate, about whether there is either a formal or a material cause mentioned in that chapter. I have doubts myself, but there's certainly the telos is mentioned, and it's actually mentioned in terms of how it's related to necessity, but nothing like conditional necessity is mentioned. But still, it's discussed, but it's discussed in a very general way. And that's not the only place, but almost the only place in the analytics. There's a long example in book 1, chapter 24, of getting explanation at the appropriate level of universality for what you're trying to explain, that actually uses a teleological example of explanation. It's a chapter that more people should pay attention to, in my view. It doesn't get enough commentary. But you're right. Take, for example, the leaf shedding example, the famous leaf shedding example in chapter 17-18. The only cause that's mentioned is a mechanical efficient cause. Why trees lose their leaves at a particular time of the year and then grow new ones, that's an obviously good teleological question, but it's not asked in the analytics. So yeah, I think partly it's operating at a very abstract level, you know, as you know, my view, it's not shared by everyone, but my view is that for the sake of which as a cause only comes into play when you're talking about living things. One can argue about the role that it plays in metaphysics lambda, obviously. and how that figures into the kinds of teleological explanations you find in the biological works. But when you look at the meteorology, there is, 3 books of explanations of what's going on in the natural world and not one teleological explanation. When you get to book 4, he kind of hardly mentions teleological explanation until he gets to chapter 12. And he says, well, many of the things we've been talking about here, like the formation of uniform parts, take place in the development of living things too. So maybe we need to think about how the uniform parts are formed for the sake of something, but that's to be done when we study the animals and plants. That's not to be done here. So, so my view is, if you're going to give a sort of completely abstract view of inquiry, there's good reason to kind of give a minimal sort of sketch account of how teleological explanation comes into play. Leave that for book 1 of the Parts of Animals, if you like. Does that get both aspects?
Yeah, definitely. On the point you just made, I think it is helpful actually, because as you say, in Generation of Animals, book 5, and in some other places, we're going to need a much more general kind of structure of explanation, not merely the teleological, which I agree with you is purely for living beings. On the first, I just wondered about this. So it seems to me that you think that asking the right questions is like super important for Aristotle. Do you think he had a sort of class in his Lyceum where let's all get together and think about the right kinds of questions? This is going to be absolutely important for everything we're doing here, asking the right kinds of questions. And maybe that's why his name gets associated with the Problemata literature.
Well, I think the Problemata literature should be, again, this is not news for people who have read anything that I've written recently, but I think the Problemata literature comes out of the last 5 chapters of the posterior analytics, because as I've argued, the only place where you find the language of problems in Aristotle extensively is in those 3 chapters in the prior analytics, where you have to formulate the problem properly, the thing you want an explanation for but don't have an explanation for, which is what a problema is, as the first step in inquiring into finding the right middle term for an explanation of that. And I think that's put into place in the posterior analytics as a way of framing inquiry. So you start by formulating a problem, like, why does cetacea have lungs? As the first step in maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it should be, why do all the animals that breathe have lungs? Maybe that should be the appropriate question. So I think Aristotle's already doing that. And we know he refers to his own problems occasionally in his scientific work. So I think the fact that all of those chapters in the Problemata always begin with deity, blah, blah, blah. And they're always asking deity about some puzzling fact, some fact that seems a little bizarre, like, why would animals that live their entire lives in the water have lungs and breathe air? So I think that the answer is that I think the Problemata literature is exactly the kind of thing that would come right out of Aristotle's view of inquiry, and may have been going on, may have been going on in the Lyceum during his lifetime. He may have sort of started a class on problems, and okay, everybody try to come up with an answer to this one. That kind of thing.
Sophia, would you like to compliment?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. And James, once again, for the answer. Now we have Constanza, the first question from the audience. Constanza, are you there?
I am here. Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. It would be a great pleasure to hear you here in Brazil too, but nice meeting you virtually.
Yes.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you on your grandson. He's so cute.
Yeah, he's now 9 years old. So those pictures were taken 2 years ago.
All right, let me formulate here what I was trying to come up as in a question form, the more directly possible. When we were talking, you were talking about metaphilosophy in the beginning of your presentation on the topic of curiosity. And I was wondering if or what actually would be your stake on the theoretical usefulness of the topics for the theme of curiosity within Aristotle. Those who already know what I'm studying and what I was doing on my thesis know that I am a bit obsessed with the topics and the use of the predicates in the forms of the questions and the problemata. I was glad with Sophia's question, so it was similar to what I was thinking, but the question specifically would be like that. And so what would you say about it? Thank you very much.
I'm not quite sure. I think I need more clarification on the question, because I'm not quite sure. I know the general ballpark of the question, but could you formulate the question maybe in a different way, or just one more time so I can get it before I try to answer?
Sure. Sorry, I'm really always very self-aware of the time that I'm using the event, and I know everyone is already very tired of looking at screens, and so I was just trying to be as quick as I could.
Okay.
Anyways, when you're talking about the investigations on natural phenomena, I get it. We use the second analytics schemata and they work very well. But when we are talking about the investigations that Aristotle is proposing in the dialectics, in the topics, he answers problems in predicates system. It's a different system that it's not talking about the hierarchy of causes or what is the better explanation for anything, but in an argument, in a dialectical exercise that is searching for an answer.
Okay.
I was thinking maybe for older children that have moral curiosities or political curiosities, how would we search for an explanation?
Okay, good. Good. That's very, very helpful. All right. Yeah, the concept of a problem plays a very important role in the topics. I've written about that. I am one of those people that takes a somewhat restricted view of the role that dialectical discourse, as it's laid out in the topics, plays in a scientific investigation. But I do think it plays a role, and I'll tell you what 2 roles I think it plays. First of all, a lot of the techniques that Aristotle develops in the topics, I don't know if this is true of all of them, but it's certainly true of many of them, and I've really looked into this, are techniques that in the topics framework, in the framework of dialectical disputation, are techniques you use either to undermine an argument that someone else is making, or you use or techniques you can use to avoid somebody undermining an argument you're making. But if you look at the actual techniques, which Aristotle often refers to as inductive techniques, epagoge, these are techniques that you can also use if you're reading a work of Democritus's, for example. You can raise exactly the same kind of questions you would raise in a dialectical disputation against a treatise by Democritus. You can also use them to criticize your own points of view or to check your own points of view. And so I think the techniques that you would teach somebody or that you would be taught yourself in learning dialectic are techniques that, for different purposes, and with the goal in mind, not of beating somebody in a debate, but in search for the truth, these techniques could be extremely useful. So when Aristotle says that the techniques that you learn in the topics can be useful as a route to the principles, I think it's things like that that he's talking about. These are techniques that you can use in any kind of context where you're pursuing knowledge. But it is the case that the topics is about, it is very aerotetic. It's very much framed in terms of questions and answers, right? That's sort of right at the beginning of the topics. That's what you're told. But the context is winning a debate. The context is not first and foremost getting at the truth about things. Nevertheless, I think the techniques that you learn in learning how to take part in a dialectical debate are techniques that can absolutely be useful in a scientific investigation. So that's how I see the relationship between the two things.
Constanza, are you satisfied? You want a quick follow-up?
Well, I would have a few follow-ups and a few questions on the power of a naturality as well, but I'll leave them aside. But I'm just glad that you recognize the topoi as an aerothetic work. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Okay, then now we got Samara. Samara, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you a lot, Daniel, everybody, Professor James. It's amazing. My question is about, we have in Aristotle the principles, the causality, and teleological. Okay, you can see this like a line, but in causality, sometimes Aristotle say maybe the causality are in us, you know. He say maybe it's not in the things, the causality. How can you say, James, it's a middle, right? And I feel a lot actuality, the science, contemporary science don't accept more teleological explanations. And I don't know. And when you remark Democritus, I perceive the difference because Democritus not see orders, right? And Aristotle see some kind of orders in the things. But my question is the problem about the knowledge with these problems, you know, because I don't know if I can say something. You understand my point, because we have these problems. When you talk about Aristotle, about theological things, the people don't accept this anymore, okay? And the causality maybe are in us, not in the things. And when you talk about the causality, you have a pluralism of explanations of the things. how can we have knowledge? I don't know, my questions, I cannot to be more clear than this, sorry.
Okay, well, I see two threads here. One having to do with, I suppose, in contemporary philosophy, the validity of teleological explanation. I think I would challenge your thought that if you bring up teleological explanation, most people would reject that idea in natural science. When I put on a different hat, I'm a Darwinian scholar. I've done a lot of work on Charles Darwin. One of my most famous or infamous papers on Darwin is called "Darwin Was a Teleologist." It provoked a very nasty response from a neo-Darwinian named Michael Gieselin, to which I responded. I think there are two thoughts here, one about biology and one about the philosophy of biology. About biology, I think if you actually look at the way biologists explain things and the way they think about things, they're every bit as teleological in the way they think and the way they explain as Aristotle is. The problem, but they will deny it. They will often deny it. And the problem is, and you can see this in Gieselin's reply to me, that many people equate the use of teleological explanation with natural theology or religious or creationist explanations. But that's a mistake. That's a philosophical mistake. You can have reasonable debates about how appealing to goals and functions explain things, but there's no question that modern biology appeals to goals and functions to explain things every bit as much as Aristotle does. How you philosophically understand that is a much debated point. But I'm going to grab a book off my shelf and I'm going to hold it in front of the screen because I want everyone to see it, and then I'll explain why I'm showing it to you. Right, first of all, I want you to notice how thick this book is. And then I want you to see the title of the book. Can you see it? It's called Nature's Purposes. And it's edited by Colin Allen, colleague of mine here in Pittsburgh, Mark Beckhoff, and George Lauder. And its subtitle is Analyses of Function and Design in Biology. It's 600 pages long, and almost every paper in here defends teleological explanation in biology. They defend it in different ways, but and many of them are biologists. Many of them are molecular biologists and anatomists, not just evolutionary biologists. So I think that's a misunderstanding. And I think it's a misunderstanding because biologists are afraid if they say they defend teleological explanations, people will think they're some kind of closet creationist, or they believe that God designed the world, and they don't want people to think that about them. So they back off, you know. Now, I do want to make one, I think, suggestion about Democritus based on what you said. I think he does see order in the world every bit as much as Aristotle does. But he doesn't see the same kind of order that Aristotle does. I think Democritus a world that if you want to really understand it, you have to get down to the atomic level and understand the interactions between indivisible particles of different shapes and so on. But he offers explanations of, he tries to tell you what the soul is and how animals with souls differ from animals without souls. And it has to do with different kinds of atoms that they're constructed from and so on. So I don't think it's a lack of a view of the world as an ordered system that Democritus has. It's just that he thinks everything can be explained in exactly the same way by reducing everything to the level of interactions between indivisible bodies. And Aristotle thinks the world is much more complicated than that. Aristotle doesn't deny that some explanations can be had at the level of interactions between basic materials. He didn't believe in atoms, but he did believe in basic elemental materials. Meteorology Book 4 offers all kinds of explanations of how materials are formed by the interactions of hot things and cold things with things that are dry and moist. It's not that he doesn't think you can explain anything at that level, but he doesn't think you can explain the differences between animals with souls and animals without souls at that level. And he doesn't think you can explain animal behavior that way, and so on. So I would just myself question whether the difference between Democritus and Aristotle is, well, Democritus doesn't believe in order and Aristotle does. I think it's a different way of accounting for the order that that's going on there. But thank you. Those were good questions. Very good questions. Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Samara and James. Now I have the last question from the audience, if I'm not mistaken. It's Maria Alice. Maria Alice, are you there?
Yes, thank you. And so I'm glad to meet you, Jim. We changed email. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So I will meet you at the end of this month. And yes. I will leave my question for there because unfortunately I have I have students from 10 minutes from now. So I will ask my question on 29 November. And I leave the invitation here for the audience if they want to follow Jim Lennox with us again with Brazilians. So nice to meet you.
So this is a group of historians of biology who have invited me to take part in their reading group on the 29th of November. So we'll be getting together then.
Yes. So
very nice to meet you.
And bye. Very nice speak from you today. Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation, Maria-Lisa. I've written it down, 29/11.
Okay, I will put the link.
Yes, do that.
I send you to your email, okay?
Okay.
And you can share with people.
Yeah, I'll share with everyone.
Okay.
So no more questions from the audience. We have one more question from the debaters. Lucas asked for one more. Lucas, please.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Jim, it's me again. So I have a question, a more general question, and concerning something you have not done yet, maybe yet, which is how the very neglected, very important and neglected chapter from posterior analytics, how does it fits into your picture, which the chapter is 12 from book 1, the chapter in which we have Aristotle talking about erotema.
Yeah.
That chapter is very, very puzzling, interesting, and neglected, because we look at the first glance, it's clear that the erotema questioning there is the concept from the topics, and Aristotle is somehow saying something about how the scientist himself or herself should have or not dialectical skills and should avoid to discuss geometry, for instance, among people who are not
don't have the appropriate knowledge.
Exactly. This, but then we have a second look, especially in the Ross division of paragraph, the second paragraph. And then there we have this distinction about two ways in which a question might be ageometrical or non-geometrical, ageometrita in Greek. And one of them is when the question is completely out of the, let's just say, the domain. So if you ask, well, is this triangle musical or not, something like that. Yeah. But the other way of being non-geometrical might point to something more interesting for your Aerotech framework from the book 2, because it's something that belongs to the domain of geometry, but mediocrely and not in a proper way. I think it's faulos, the adverb he uses that. And I wonder that this might point to those things Aristotle describes in topics and sophistic refutations as the fallacies or paralogisms from the sciences, things like maybe it's not Bryson exactly, but those kinds of arguments that has a vicinity to Bryson's argument, or kind of geometrical mistakes. We don't know too much about those kinds of arguments. Yeah. But that might be interesting for you. And I think this connects with Sophia's second question or first question, I don't remember, which is, well, we have to start from this Aerotech framework, but we have also to put the right answers with those Aerotech framework in the background. Then when it comes to phrasing the right questions in this more fine-grained way, we need more specific norms. Yeah. And then I wonder if there is some place in the Posterior Analytics book 1 in which Aristotle not addresses, but at least touches this issue, is this passage from 112. I think it's very, very important for your project. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on this.
I really don't. And your question makes me wonder why I didn't think to have a whole chapter in my book on that topic. No, I mean, other than knowing the chapter and knowing what you're talking about, I hadn't thought about that. And I thank you very much, because I find that really, really interesting. I think I'm going to spend the afternoon looking through that text, in fact. But I don't have anything to say except what you've suggested sounds very plausible to me, that he's already looking forward sort of to book 2 in that chapter, and talking about questions that are appropriate to a domain and questions that are inappropriate to a domain, and so on. So thank you. I hadn't explored that chapter enough, and I don't have anything to add to what you said at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it's a topic for your next paper.
Maybe. Thanks, Lucas. Thank you.
So, Jim, if you have more time, Roberto Grasso has one last question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Roberto, please.
Okay, first of all, nice to meet you, Professor Lennox, and thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting for me.
Thank you.
So my question is, it is very clear now, I think, that if we don't have a notion of a function, we cannot really progress much. And the example of respiration is very clear, because if we only look at gills and lungs, without knowing what is the function, we will never really get the things right in our explanation. But on the other hand, we know that Aristotle is deadly wrong about the function of gills and lungs. It's not refrigeration of some vital heat, as we know. So my question, my curiosity actually, is do we find in Aristotle anything like guiding principle for the right identification of functions of organs? Because how do we know what is the function of an organ? Is there something like on the soul, about that, or is, I don't know, how do we try to identify the function of lungs and organs or any other living things for that matter?
This is something I've thought a lot about. I wrote a long chapter in a book on soul, heat, and pneuma on this topic. And your question is a really, really good one, because you're right. Aristotle doesn't get it right by our lights. But when you look at the history of this subject, it's interesting how many things he does get right. So for example, he does figure out that gills and lungs have the same function. Now he says it's cooling, but I'll tell you how he figures out, and that's talked about more in the last chapter of my book. I'll tell you how he does figure out that they have the same function, and he's correct about that. He notes that the connections between the heart of fish and the gills is directly analogous to the connection between the alveoli in the lungs and the blood vessels that come from the heart. He notices that the movements of gills, and they're not just passive, fish do this on purpose, and he notices that it's for the sake of bringing in and expelling water, getting water running across the gills. He notices, well, I won't go into all the other details. There's a whole lot of things that he notices that are analogous between lungs and gills. And on that basis, he concludes that they have the same function. Now, he thinks the function is cooling. Okay, why does he think that? Well, first of all, think about what happens to animals when they die. What do people doing autopsies do to determine the time of death? They take the temperature, because bodies start to cool as soon as they're no longer alive. So definitely animals, when they're alive, have heat. Aristotle thinks that heat needs to be moderated. Okay. He's very clear, and he talks about this right at the end of On Respiration, that there's a relationship between breathing and the rate of breathing and the heartbeat. He actually gets the exact relationship wrong, but he knows there's a relationship between them. There's a relationship between how hard I breathe when I'm going for a 5-mile run and how fast my heart beats. It's a, not a direct relationship, but there's a definite relationship there. It's not until the 17th century that William Harvey is studying this relationship, and he's quite puzzled about it. And people like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke start studying air to see if there's something to see if air is not a simple element, but maybe a combination of more simple elements. And they start studying to see whether it's possible that some element of the air is actually being transmitted to the blood. And maybe something is being transmitted from the blood to the lungs. But Aristotle already had said very similar things in On Respiration. He notes that the vessels coming from the heart and those smallest tubes in the lungs lie right next to each other. And he actually talks as if he's thinking that there might be at least the coolness from the air being transmitted to the actual blood. It's not entirely clear, but my point is, until you get to basically the late 18th century and people have identified oxygen and have identified the relationship between oxygen and combustion that people start to figure out something like our modern view of what breathing is all about, what respiration is all about. And lo and behold, the fish do a similar thing with gills that we do with lungs. Aristotle didn't get that last step right, but he got an awful lot right. And he maybe got all that you could get right until you had the kind of chemistry that would allow you to break down air into its elements. So I think he did damn well. I'm not sure he could have done much better.
Yeah, thank you. I just a clarification. I wasn't trying to underestimate Aristotle.
No. And I wasn't trying to defend him either. But my point is, if you put it in historical context, it becomes a little. You become a little more sympathetic to
absolutely. And actually,
and you just take our modern understanding and say, what? But he got it wrong. You know, he just got it totally wrong. Well, no, he didn't get it totally wrong, but he didn't get it all right either. But I think he did well considering the context, and I think his view that you have to be asking these functional questions. But he also have to be asking questions about the actual physical connections between parts in the body. That was really important to his way of thinking too. So yeah, it's a really good question. I thought about it a lot.
Thank you very much. And actually, I'm relieved about something you said, like that things that Aristotle inherits from the chemistry of his time are actually important to understand some details of how he thinks about living beings. And yeah, I have the same perception for other matters, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good question.
So I think we're through for today. I would like to thank once again Professor Lennox for coming, and everybody else here also for coming and for their questions. Once again,
I wanted to thank everyone for their questions. All really good questions. I really enjoyed this session. And Daniel, thank you so much for setting it up and for helping me with the technology as well.
No problem. We hope to see you again soon on the next lectures too.
I would love to come to Brazil sometime soon.
Yeah, let's work on that. We're getting close. We're getting close. Everybody, thanks a lot for coming.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.